Today's episode is brought to you by Powbox, the easiest way to make your practice email HIPAA compliant. It works with the Gmail or Outlook account you already use, and your clients never have to log into a portal to read your messages. Get $250 off an annual plan with promo code MODERN.
Being a therapist, I know the work doesn't end when the session does. Notes, billing, scheduling, insurance follow-ups, it can all eat into your nights. That's why Katie and I use Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that go on in our work, the things that happen with our clients, things that happen in our profession. And we are in the midst of Pride Month, and Katie and I have a lot of wonderful guests who have lived experiences that are sharing their time with us, and we're very gracious for them in the ways that they're helping us to broaden our horizons. And there's a little bit of irony in this episode in that Katie and I are talking about allyship. And when it comes to lived experiences and doing ally work, which is an episode that we've done in the past, you can find a link to that in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. When it comes to doing ally work, one of the main things that Katie and I have learned is don't center ourselves when it comes to working with communities that we're not directly a part of. And the irony is that this is a Curt and Katie episode where we're talking about ally work, but what we really wanted to lean into in this episode is ally work is awkward. And it is not a destination. It is a ongoing learning opportunity, and particularly for people who, Katie and I both come from cis white het backgrounds, that there is constantly going to be places that we stumble, places that we make mistakes, both in the work that we do with clients and the larger community that we have with people. And there's a certain brand of awkwardness that ends up falling into that. And that's really what we're wanting to be able to talk about and highlight today, because as an ongoing learning experience, it's uncomfortable. And we wanted to kind of talk about our experiences in this space to normalize it to anybody else who might be getting into this work and finding out, oh, that's a lot more uncomfortable than I thought that it would be. Katie.
I don't know what to respond right now.
So, Katie, how are you awkward?
I'm awkward all the time, but that's also part of my own neurotype and those types of things. I'm excited about this episode. We have so many episodes, like you mentioned, Curt, that are relevant to this conversation. And I don't know that we've talked about this particular element of the challenges of being an ally, the challenges of working cross-culturally in all the different meanings of culture, and holding a different identity or set of identities than the person in the room with you. And I know for myself, there have been times when I've done a pretty good job, and there have been times when I've stumbled and clunked and made things awkward, not irreparably so, but required some repair work to be able to continue moving forward in the relationship. That being said, even clients that I've been pretty clunky with just kind of blurted out the differences and said, hey, how is this going to impact our work together? Or done some of those things. Those clients have stuck with me, I think, because I was able to tap back into humility, tap back into what was actually happening in the room, what was most important in the work. But for me, I think the takeaways I'm hoping folks will get from this episode are, one, it's awkward. It's horrible sometimes because of how difference has been villainized within our society. And two, it's really rich clinically because if we're able to address different layers of difference, different layers of privilege and marginalization, I think truly understanding the person in the room can be, or to the best of our abilities, understanding the person in the room can be very rewarding, both personally, but also in the clinical work.
So I think we're going to kind of tick a lot of boxes off in kind of the front of this episode before. This really isn't an episode around say this in this situation, don't say this in this situation. We're going to acknowledge this, but one of the things that I've seen across the course of my career is early on when clients would talk about, and particularly parents would talk about some of the marginalized communities that their children were coming into therapy with during intake phone calls. Early on in my career, it felt like there, for white therapists, was just kind of an ability to pass muster in those calls as far as saying, oh, I'm a white therapist or I'm a straight therapist. Is your kid going to have any issues with talking with a white therapist about that? And 15, 20 years ago, that was aware enough.
Revolutionary.
That was revolutionary. And that is thankfully no longer the case. Well, it might still be in several places, but what we're encouraging is that it goes beyond just kind of a checklist of phrases that, there's some sort of key to be able to get people to come in and show that you have done your work in the space. That we're also going to talk about many of the mistakes that Katie and I have made, that we have talked with other people of all backgrounds in the therapeutic space, as well as clients, as far as mistakes that they've seen from therapists. But this is hopefully beyond just kind of a basics of say these phrases kind of thing. But I think the first thing that we have to put out there is just kind of the fragility aspect that shows up in ourselves when we are confronted with things that we don't know. And I think that this is something that I've heard you talk about very eloquently for a lot of the time that I've known you. And I'm going to give you kind of the ability to talk about this first.
What are you just saying that so I'll have to speak or is there something specific you're referring to?
Sometimes I just talk for a very long time and then it's your turn. So
Speaking about race or sexuality or gender or any of the identities that we hold can be very vulnerable. And for myself, when I don't have knowledge about someone else's identity and or I make a misstep, I make an assumption, when I use a wrong pronoun or I overemphasize someone's marginalized identity as if that's their whole identity, those types of things, I can feel pretty horrible. There's a lot of shame when I make a mistake, and that vulnerability that's already present in the room is something that can lead to feeling very fragile. And I know that there are times very early on in my career that fragility turned into white woman tears, that turned into requiring someone in a marginalized body to reassure me and do some emotional labor. And fortunately, I feel like I've done a lot of work in this. I'm still a work in progress. We all are. And I'm more able to acknowledge, correct, pivot, try to sort through what happened there and how do I redirect my attention to the relationship, do the repair work that's necessary, and take the emotional labor off my client. It's challenging because it's something where the relationship, depending on what stage you're in, whether this is a longstanding client or someone who's newer to your practice, some can hold larger ruptures than others, and some it may be something where you're really struggling to determine how do I come back to the work that's more important than my misstep, my mistake. And so when we are able to acknowledge the harm, the mistake, and move forward, I think that gives some relief, and it also provides a space to get into the muck a little bit, to get into the messiness, which, back to the title of the episode, kind of awkward ally, it can feel really uncomfortable because the relationship work now has a lot more layers than if you were working somebody who shared, the exact same identities that you have.
Quick question for therapists listening. Do you use Gmail or Outlook for client communication? Here's something most therapists don't realize. Even with a business or workspace account, Gmail and Outlook aren't fully HIPAA compliant. That gap is on you to fix. That's where Powbox comes in. Powbox automatically encrypts every email you send, and your clients read it right at their inbox. No portals, no passwords, no extra steps. It works with the Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 account you already have, so nothing about your day-to-day changes.
Setup takes minutes, there's no training required, and Powbox's US-based support team is there if you need them. Listeners of Modern Therapist Survival Guide get $250 off an annual plan. Visit powbox.com, that's PAUBOX, and use promo code MODERN.
This is something that it's a lot easier to see and deal with when it's happening to somebody else. And it can often involve a lot of not knowing that you're in it until you're in it kinds of situations for yourself. And it feels like defensiveness, but really what I've learned from many of the people that we've talked to through the years is the layers that it adds is onto our clients as far as now having to take care of us in these situations by trying to over apologize for making a mistake or saying something that comes across as a microaggression, even if it's not something that we intended. And a lot of times where this fragility ends up coming out is then leading into trying to overcorrect or overdeal for that to get approval to say, hey, no, I'm with it. I'm immediately imagining Dr. Evil from Austin Powers 2, where he's doing the Macarena, trying to prove how cool he is to his son Scott. And it's just completely out of space. But this is where you're trying to get some kind of stamp of approval from your client or from the community that you're trying to support, and really it ends up becoming just kind of all right, now we're having to take care of your desire to be approved rather than your fragility desires.
Yeah, kind of auditioning or trying to get that gold star. And I think that's hard to avoid when you're trying to do the work and it feels really good to be validated that you're doing the work in the right way. And I think it's important to stay humble and to recognize that even if someone is approving of the work in the moment, that doesn't mean the difference doesn't exist and that there's not going to be other times when things go off the rails or there's ruptures to address.
One of the reels that Katie had sent me in preparation for this episode, and we'll also include a link to this in our show notes, is from Ashani Mfuko's anti-racism school. She does a lot of really good work, and shout out to her and a lot of the space where she does talk to particularly white allies trying to do some of this work. And it really rings in a lot of her videos, a lot of her messages to feelings that I've had in the past particularly around one of the stories that she highlights or shares is when particularly white people are trying to do work and run into some of their own situations and don't see Black people coming in to support them in the same way that they feel that they are supporting the Black community. This is the example that she's using. And so there becomes kind of this response that's, well, why am I continuing to do this work if other communities aren't coming to support me in the same kind of situation? I'm going to take my ball and go home, is
Yeah.
more or less what she describes. One of the reasons why Katie and I wanted to have this episode be in the realm of us talking about this in the space that we are is that's an incredibly normal feeling. And it's one that is not to necessarily take your ball and go home and go and stop doing any of this kind of work. And it's not a feeling that you necessarily need to go and add on to the people that you're trying to do ally work with. That's just going back down our ladder here of trying to, over apologize or make things about you or centering you. But I wanted to highlight that there is a space where allies are going to have feelings, and they're going to have feelings where when they aren't getting their gold star of approval sorts of situations, when they're being called out or when they're being identified that, hey, you need to go and do your own work on this, those feelings are valid. And they're feelings that I think really come from being in this awkward ally space that I at least want to highlight that talk with other allies about these feelings because it is part of the growth process to recognize that you're still not the center of things, that there is space that you're going to have your feelings hurt and you're not going to be understood, or you're going to be not getting what you want in kind of this savior sort of space. And it's okay to have these feelings, and it's okay to process through them so that way you can kind of continue going on and doing the work that you need to do. If there are consultation groups that do come from a diverse sort of space, and it is something that ends up getting structured as part of those discussions, even better. But I really do want to highlight that sometimes the reactions that we have are only really best going to be processed with other allies. So that way you can kind of collectively come back and do the work.
In listening to those reels, I think the biggest takeaway for me was when this work starts feeling transactional or conditional or is about that gold star, that acceptance, approval, and affirmation from marginalized folks, it becomes distorted and becomes potentially unhelpful. And I think if that's happening in the room, there can be just a very difficult dynamic that appears. And so, again, I'm going to reiterate, process this on your own. These are potentially, other folks might call it countertransference responses. It could be just your own comfort versus your commitment to this type of work or even the clinical work, and being able to sort that out and sit in that discomfort to kind of increase your distress tolerance in this awkward space is critical. Because otherwise you're gonna make mistakes, you're gonna make it about you. And if you're exhausted, and I think we had an episode with Dr. Sonia Lott around white exhaustion. I don't remember, white fatigue. I think it was white fatigue. If you get into that space and you're exhausted, you're not gonna show up as a clinician to the best of your ability. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to do things that are driven by this really deep discomfort with how bad all of this can be for folks in marginalized bodies, and how, if you were in a privileged body, are part of the problem at times. And that can feel really horrible, and it can make you feel very defensive.
I think we tried to do an episode like this a few years ago, and it's taken us a while to even get to this point. And by no means are we the end-all be-all experts of this, and if anything, we're embracing that this is awkward and probably, we'll get feedback on the show from lots of people. If there are people who are maybe further along in their awkwardness than us, we're happy for introductions. You can send us their names. But we had tried to do an episode like this a few years ago, and we'd reached out to a consultant from one of the communities that we were talking about doing this kind of work. And Katie and I had a lot of questions about our white awkwardness and our ally awkwardness in this. And I remember getting out of that meeting and feeling they just don't quite get what we're trying to talk about as far as being in our awkward space.
Yeah.
And I think that it took until kind of preparing for this episode to really realize that what has changed for me is having a lot of discussions over the last several years with people like you and really other white cishet allies that it just is kind of talking about, yeah, that's part of the territory is you're going to be awkward. You're going to be called out on stuff that you are a representation. I get called out as a white man representation of all white men kind of things in a lot of spaces that early on felt incredibly shaming, felt incredibly awkward, but even potentially humiliating at points. And what I've come to realize the more in these spaces is that it's not always about me personally, but about what I represent. Sometimes it is specific actions that I do, but in order to really understand this wasn't necessarily continuing to hear or seek approval from people in the spaces to say, okay, finally you get it, but really more of other people like you, Katie, like other people like me to be able to say, you know what? It's awkward. It happens. And the work is really in continuing to show up and recognizing that it's not something that you might have particularly done, but this is what somebody in the space needs to be able to express in order to actually help them be able to express something to you.
In hearing you reflect on this, I wanna also provide some feedback, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
In the beginning of these conversations, my sense for you, but also for me, was the defensiveness was high because of how awkward, how uncomfortable, potentially how much shame ended up being in the space, and a lack of understanding of intention. Our intentions, I think, have been good for a long time. We're not perfect. We're not saying that we're in a space that we are the end all be all of how this work goes. And so being misunderstood, quote unquote, and feeling that protectiveness come up and make it hard to get to this part of the conversation. This is reinforcing your point about having conversations with other allies, because I think if you can move past the defensiveness, and I think one of the folks that we've watched in one of these reels is saying, "Not all white folks." Okay, now we're past that. Now listen to
Right,
the
right,
rest of
right.
this. I think that being able to really listen and take it in as a dynamic and not a personal assault is really important. Yes, if you've done some harm, take full accountability and all of that. I'm not saying not to take accountability for missteps or outright harm that you're causing. It's when it's part of a larger dynamic and there's still that internal protector that comes in and says, "But it's not me. I'm not trying to do that. You're misunderstanding me." It feels unjustified, even if potentially it's 10 to 20 to 50% justified or whatever it is. I'm not talking about that piece. From the ally perspective, if I'm being attacked, and I put air quotes, I know you can't see that, but if I'm being attacked while trying to be an ally, it can feel very disheartening, it can feel very confusing, and it can feel deeply wounding. And to put it bluntly, We have to get over that, deal with it, and talk to other allies about it and sort through what is my piece in this and how do I continue to do this work.
Being a fellow therapist, I know the work doesn't end when the session does. The notes, the scheduling, the billing, the insurance follow-ups, all of that admin can quietly take over your nights and weekends.
And we've both seen how the right systems can really change what private practice feels like. When we're talking with therapists who are overwhelmed, one of the biggest pain points is trying to hold too many disconnected pieces together.
That's why we want to share Simple Practice. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high trust certified, and built specifically for therapists.
Simple Practice is designed for the real-life complexity of private practice, helping with everyday admin that can pile up between sessions.
My favorite part? The all-in-one integration. Notes, billing, telehealth scheduling, and client communications are all connected in one spot, so I'm not bouncing around between separate systems.
And their AI scribe note taker can help make documentation more thorough and much faster, so you can spend less time catching up on notes and more time focused on your clients and your life outside of work.
Plus, if you're starting out or growing your practice, Simple Practice also offers credentialing support, which can take a big headache out of insurance enrollment.
If you're ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is the perfect time to try Simple Practice.
Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months.
Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've learned from being in some of these situations is that it's going to be sometimes where somebody's energy gets directed at you, and sitting with that defensiveness is recognizing that it's still not your space to be able to defend yourself. And that part of the process sometimes is being the representative of where strong feelings are going to get directed at. And well, you might not have done anything wrong. You still don't get to go and get a gold star for sitting through that. And you probably aren't going to necessarily going to go and seek out an apology. You're being in that space is awkward.
Yeah.
And we're talking larger kinds of spaces here. And I think you and I, because of the kind of work that we do, we tend to work both in microsystems and macro systems where these kinds of issues come up. But for a lot of our audience where most of this interaction is probably going to be happening one-on-one with clients, I'd like to make that pivot here as well. And this is probably also where most of these mistakes can probably end up having the most impact because of the vulnerability of the therapeutic relationship.
So handling a clinical rupture, we've got a whole episode on mistakes and should you admit mistakes and how to handle mistakes in therapy. So we'll link to that in the show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. But when it is about marginalization, when it's about microaggressions or macroaggressions or just plain bias, I think it's important to acknowledge we've talked about pivoting, about trying to acknowledge and move on. But if it's truly harm that has happened, I think going into a defensive stance, trying to explain intent, trying to minimize the client's experience. As I'm saying this, I know that all the clinicians are like, of course, this makes sense. But if any of that's happening, you're adding to the harm. And so being able to acknowledge, understand, process, if appropriate, and work through the rupture is really important.
And I think a lot of times the same kinds of patterns that we're talking about here is working through the ruptures a lot of times can start out with, well, what I meant was.
Yeah.
And instead of leaning into kind of the what the impact was, how that's showing up in the process of the therapeutic relationship, it now becomes potentially back to taking care of you and taking
Yes.
care of how you were coming across rather than what it might be for a client. And I think that this is an incredibly hard skill to learn if you don't have some of the experience of interacting with these communities. If you're learning for the first time in session, you're gonna make mistakes. Like,
Yeah.
I think that that's just it, and to be professional about it is being able to make mistakes better, and
Yes.
it's not necessarily about, avoiding them, but it's, doing it in a way that is not dismissing, not pathologizing. It's doing it in a way that is decentering your intent and being able to really be able to say in a curious and not dismissive way. And this is really going to be, kind of in the tone of how you talk about this is I want to validate what your experience is of me saying this rather than what's that like for you when I say it that way.
I want to acknowledge one other piece to this because I think it's important to recognize. If you have never brought differences into your room and you've not talked about the intersectionality that sits in each of you and the way in which you might address it, my assumption is that your client is not going to tell you, "Hey, ouch, that hurt. You just said something awful." They just aren't gonna come back.
Yep.
So, the fact that you've been called out, I think should be considered a win, because if you're called out, there's still hope to try to repair the relationship. And so, if that piece of information can feel helpful, I'm not saying go harm freely and if they call you out, you're okay. But recognizing that there's still a relationship there to repair versus you completely othering your client and your client feeling no longer safe with you. That being said, we do want to make sure we don't center ourselves in the room. Not every time that race or sexuality or any types of marginalization, not every time that comes up should it be, and what is it like to talk with a straight person or to talk with a white person or talk with a whatever, right? To a able-bodied person. I think it's something where this awkwardness, I know I've definitely walked down this road and I quickly jumped back
Mhm.
when it was clear the client was like, "What are you talking about?" But yes, it is important to acknowledge what's in the room, but not to the detriment of the clinical work. And there's a really great reel from Dr. Raquel Martin, a licensed clinical psychologist, podcast host, and scientist. Like, I love her work. I follow her. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well. But just talking about how centering yourself in that space, even though you're acknowledging something that's important, can completely miss the clinical work that's actually happening. And so this is where I feel like it's not a tightrope. I don't think it's that skinny, but there are some guardrails you may want to put up to be able to sort through. Am I making this about me? Am I making this about our differences? Am I overstating a majority perspective and assuming an impact on the client? And so being able to decenter yourself and try to read the room after having laid a groundwork of anti-racist, anti-prejudice kind of practices within the room, I think that you're not going to always make the right choice, whether you bring it in or not. But I think the more you're focused on the clinical work and impact on the client, the stronger I think your outcome will be.
And I think this is one that is particularly heightened when there are intersectional identities,
Absolutely.
where I'll speak about my learning process on this, especially in learning that not all people are white men. I know, shocking. um, but the experience that I had is not universal, and I'm over exaggerating here, but that not everybody experiences things the same way. In unlearning, and as I continue to unlearn that, it feels like calculus sometimes, trying to figure out, okay, which one of these identities that I don't have should I check in on right now? And what am I missing that the client is saying or doing while I'm trying to do this calculus? I'm getting better at it, but I'm still not, great in every single situation. And I think that this is really where ongoing consultation is the answer, because as much as you may prepare for any kind of community, the more and more intersectional identities that you end up working with, the more that you're just going to run into brand new stuff that
Yeah.
you've never even imagined being possible before. And I still run into that, something that I like embracing and I like learning about. And there are ways, as far as, being able to talk about that process with clients. But my best experiences in this is finding people to consult with that can help me to be able to be more prepared for next sessions. And a lot of times it comes with breaking down sessions that I've already had and being asked questions. Well, did you ask about this? No, I didn't. I didn't even know that I should have asked about that. That's really where breaking down your process has some of the most growth.
Well, and I think it helps to make sure that you're not requiring your client to be your instructor or your teacher in
Mhm.
some way. We've had so many conversations about this in episodes about specific populations, and almost always it's that balance between what is your experience with this versus what the heck are you talking about?
Mhm.
And so being able to have folks to consult with, Googling with caution, depending on, the sources that are cited there, and learning about the situation with enough depth that you can then have the conversation about what does this mean to you? And how is this showing up in your own experience? And what is your relationship with this dynamic or concept or whatever it is? Because the more emotional and mental labor that we put on to our clients just so that we can understand their experience, the less they're engaged with the emotional work, with the embodied work. They're thinking about, okay, what does my therapist know? How do I explain this? What's going on? And most folks are not going to be able to find a therapist that aligns exactly with all of their identities, with all of their characteristics, with all of their lived experience. There are going to be gaps. And we can limit them because we do have the interwebs. We have each other, and being able to connect with a diverse clinician population, diverse perspectives, I think is critical to do this work.
As you're talking about not putting the work on your clients to educate you about things, one of the things that I've tried to embrace more in the last couple of years is when I'm going and learning about working with clients from identities that I don't share, is not just going to academic sources on what these identities are. It's, if it's working with queer clients, it's reading queer literature. If it's working with Black clients, it's going to events where it's centering on performances around Blackness. And it's being able to see this in ways that aren't necessarily just something that comes from peer reviewed research, which often, has its own whole levels of things, but it's about getting more into kind of the lived experiences in ways and being able to see the themes that emerge, not from our clients first and foremost, but also being able to see how other people in the space interact with that. And it does potentially come with some of the awkwardness that, we were referring to earlier, but I think that a lot of being able to immerse yourself in some of the non-academic stuff is the best ways to be able to get this.
It's so interesting because I think there are different ways we can get access to content that helps us understand lived experience differently. Many of the guests that we have on the podcast talk about content creators or books or movies or those types of things. And so I really appreciate those things. I also believe being in continuing education spaces that are specific to some of these marginalized identities, these different perspectives of the world can be very rich. And for a reason I don't love. And one of the reasons that I don't love about that is oftentimes there will be a talk about how to work with X population, and you go to that talk and you were one of the only people, from the majority culture or whatever, and everyone else shares that culture and is sitting and talking. So you get a lot of great information, but it's clear from those spaces that a lot of folks find it too awkward to be in those spaces, or they don't value that information or those connections strongly enough. And so, yeah, it can be hard to go into those training spaces, but when it is a space that is welcoming allies of other identities to be in that space, I think it's really important to take advantage of those because there's so much clinical knowledge you can learn. And it's way better than forcing your client, who may not be a therapist, to teach you how to treat them.
I think I'd like to have one last little kind of point here that we talk about before we close out, which is not just trying to have the vibes. It's actually, and we've seen this transformation across our careers. It was, having cultural expertise, and then thankfully the systems around that changed to focusing more on cultural humility. But I think that even cultural humility can sometimes be bypassed as far as just, oh yeah, I'm not an expert on this, please tell me more. It's kind of throwing that work. Oh, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. But it's still very dismissive. But I think that, you can decorate your office with flags. You can put out Facebook posts or Instagram things that have a filter that supports whatever community is in the news at a particular moment. But what I hear in this space is you're never going to fully get it. You're never, you're going to be one who doesn't misunderstand as much.
Yeah. Kind of failing better.
Yeah. You can find our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. Follow us on our social media. Let us know what else needs to happen in awkward spaces. If you are an awkward ally, talk with other awkward allies. And until next time, stay awkward. I'm Curt Widhalm. She's Katie Vernoy. See you next time.
Thanks again to Powbox for sponsoring today's episode.
Powbox helps therapists send and receive email that's secure, HIPAA compliant, and easy for clients to open. Get $250 off at powbox.com with promo code MODERN.
Private practice has enough built-in complexity. Simple Practice brings notes, billing, scheduling, telehealth, insurance, and client communication into one place. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.